Hello, Louis.
Hello, Shad. Shad, can you hear me
I can hear you.
and see me?
Of course I can.
Yay, we're connected. Thank you for being patient with me in getting through this technology. How are you this morning?
I'm good. And you?
Good, wonderful. It's nice to see you. I still have the information you sent me and from the meeting a couple of years ago, and it's in my archives. We're creating not only a museum, but we're creating a pretty extensive archive as well.
Yeah.
And we've just received message this morning that we received some original authentic letters from a couple of prisoners in Cahaba that perished on the Sultana. And about a month ago, I actually received, I was able to acquire two letters, one written to Frederick Speed and one written by Frederick Speed to a third party. So all of these things keep adding up. We're getting a nice collection of documents now. So it's nice to see you, and I'm glad to be able. I hope I can be of help to you today.
Okay. So I'll ask you these questions. There are 6 of them, and I will
Okay.
go through them one at a time.
Well, before you get started, could you tell me a little bit about what your project is? What is this for?
I am doing a capstone project, creating an identity or promotional campaign for an existing nonprofit organization.
Oh, okay. Very good. Very good. Well, I'm glad to be able to be with you this morning and hope I can help. So if you like, we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. So the first question, what happened to the Sultana?
Okay. As you may know, and as you, of course you do know, the Sultana was a twin paddle wheel steamboat that was being utilized at the end of the Civil War to ferry passengers and particularly captured Union soldiers back to the North that had recently been released from Andersonville and Cahaba prisons in the South. And on the early morning of April the 27th of 1865, at about 2 a.m., the boiler system on the steamboat exploded, catching the entire boat on fire. And for the next several hours, the boat burned down to the waterline and eventually sank into the Mississippi River and the muddy area on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi, just across the river from Memphis and just barely upriver from Memphis at Marion, Arkansas. This tragedy, which killed an estimated 1,200 people that we know for sure, resulted in total casualties of nearly 2,200 people, of which 2,000 were just released prisoners of war. This tragedy, this steamboat explosion and tragedy, has been acknowledged by a congressional resolution from the United States House of Representatives as being the greatest maritime disaster in all of United States history. And what makes this tragedy even worse, even more egregious, is the fact that it could have been avoided. However, there was incidents of greed and corruption among some of the ranking Union officers in Vicksburg, Mississippi, who, in exchange for kickbacks from the steamboat captain, or offers of kickbacks from the steamboat captain, they overloaded the boat, which was designed to carry 376 passengers, with 6 times its capacity of nearly 2,200 passengers. And they did so knowing that the boiler system was dangerous in that it was leaking steam and boiling water at the time that it was overloaded with so many people. And so, as a result of corruption and malfeasance in office by ranking Union soldiers and illicit relationship with the steamboat captain, this became the greatest maritime tragedy in our history, with the total destruction of the steamboat and the loss of at least 1,200 lives.
Mhm. What is the historic significance of the event?
Well, as with most great events, there are multiple reasons why their importance should always be remembered and stand out in our history. The first, of course, is the magnitude of the tragedy. This tragedy is very comparable to the more famous Titanic. Yet it's much more egregious. It's a much more disastrous event for American history, because all of the passengers and crew members aboard the steamboat were all Americans, and they were all right at the end of the Civil War, and the vast majority of those passengers who were Union soldiers had just been released from the prison camps in the South. And after many years of fighting and suffering the privations of war and prison camp, they were finally on their way home. And then, of course, they were betrayed by their own ranking officers in Vicksburg. So the magnitude of the tragedy is one reason it's important. Another is because it was the last great tragedy of the Civil War. Most people who know anything about American history are well aware of the names of the great battles that were fought in the Civil War. But so few people know about the Sultana tragedy. It occurred less than 2 weeks after the end of the Civil War, and it is referred to as the last great tragedy of the Civil War. To put it in perspective, if the Sultana steamboat, would have been a battle instead of a steamboat tragedy, it would have been the 11th greatest battle in the Civil War when considering Union casualties, Union soldier deaths and casualties. It would have been the 11th greatest battle of the Civil War. And so many of those battlegrounds are today state parks or national parks. And yet, this tragedy, which is very equal to many of those battles regarding casualties and deaths, it has been virtually forgotten. Another reason that it is important is that we fail to remember that the victims of this great tragedy were predominantly soldiers who had served for lengths of time up to 4 years or more, fighting for the Union in an effort to save the Union, to save the United States, and to eliminate the existence of slavery at the time. And so the entire importance of the Civil War and the purpose of the Civil War seems to be compacted into this last great event of the Civil War. And so we have these reasons. And then finally, history, not to use an old cliche, but history is important to us because if we don't remember our history, then we may not remember who we are as a people. We may make the same mistakes we've made in the past, and we must learn from our history and know who we are. And so, for those four reasons, this tragedy of the Sultana is of great importance to our American character and to our American history.
What exhibits are in the museum?
The story of the Sultana is much like the story of the Titanic in that there are a lot of authentic original artifacts from the boat. Just like the Titanic Museum, there are very few actual artifacts from the Titanic because it sank and was the artifacts and the pieces of the boat of the ship were unattainable. The steamboat Sultana burned all the way to the waterline and then sank and was later covered over by the river and the soil of the river. Because most of the boat was totally destroyed and then covered by the river, there are very few artifacts actually. And the museum will actually be a museum to tell the story, the human side of what happened. However, we do have some extremely interesting artifacts. We do have a few small pieces of wood from the steamboat. We have artifacts from the people who were aboard the boat, personal items of which today were family heirlooms of the various descendant families of the men aboard the Sultana. And we have their personal artifacts, their personal possessions. We have letters from them to their families. We have their photographs. We have walking canes and pipes. We have buttons from their tunics. We have medals that they won in the war. We have carvings that they did, combs, hair combs and beard combs that were made by these men out of wood. We have family heirlooms that they brought back with them from the war. And these things have been donated to the museum by individuals and by descendant families. Most of our artifacts, however, come from the very expansive collection of Mr. Gene Saliker from River Grove, Illinois, who is also the author of one of the two extremely good books, the two books about the Sultana. Yes, Disaster on the Mississippi by Gene Saliker. He has been collecting artifacts from the Sultana for, I'd say, close to 30 years. And the museum will actually exhibit his private collection, which he has very kindly donated to the museum. In fact, his collection is the heart and soul of the museum and is the reason why we decided to build a large 22,000 square foot museum to replace the very small 1,000 square foot museum that we now have. So the museum is designed to tell the human story of the Sultana rather than to display artifacts from the Sultana. But it does an extremely good job of telling this amazing story.
What information about the organization would you like people to know?
Excuse me. In 2013, a group of Sultana historians, you might say, people who are just interested in the story, but who were not professional historians, with the help of Gene Saliker and another author named Jerry Potter, who wrote The Sultana Disaster, which, yes, you have that book, The Sultana Tragedy. With their assistance, we began to put information, artifacts, letters, photographs together, and we held 3 major exhibits in Marion, Arkansas, and at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, Arkansas. These exhibits brought in several thousand people to learn the story. And we decided at that point that it was necessary to make the whole country aware of this unknown story. And so in 2013, we formed a nonprofit organization called the Sultana Historical Preservation Society, Inc., Incorporated. It is a nonprofit, tax-exempt 501c3 organization, so that all donations and contributions to it are tax exempt. You can deduct them from your taxes annually. In 2015, this organization opened the first small museum of less than 1,000 square feet in Marion, Arkansas. And it was filled with artifacts and exhibits from Mr. Salaker's collection, a lot of photographs and storyboards, and a 14-foot long model of the Sultana that was built and then later restored by Mr. Salaker. The museum began to interest people locally, and then the interest in the story began to spread regionally and later nationally. And so beginning in 2015, with the opening of the museum, we began to invite guests and visitors to learn the story 4 days a week, Thursday through Sunday. And we began to develop this nonprofit organization as a vehicle to tell the story nationally. We created a 7-minute video that went on YouTube, and it caught the attention of people in the national media. Since 2015, major documentaries have been made and are now being shown on the major media channels, such as the Travel Channel, the History Channel, public broadcasting. A 90-minute documentary was made by videographers Mike and Mark Marshall, narrated by actor Sean Astin, which is now being shown on Amazon Prime. And most recently, National Geographic Network has approached us about the making of a 1-hour documentary for their Nat Geo network. In addition to that, we've been informed that there are people who are working on the beginnings of a screenplay in Hollywood for hopefully either a major motion picture or a multiple series event on Amazon Prime, all telling the story. Because of these documentaries and this new national attention, the Congress of the United States, along with their resolution, attracted the attention of the states who provided soldiers to the Sultana from the various northern states. And now those states have all passed resolutions and sent them to, well, I should say 3 of them have passed resolutions, and the others we're hoping will, and have sent them to our museum for a public display as well. In 2018, the William J. Clinton Presidential Library invited us to exhibit the Sultana in the Presidential Library. And over a period of a few weeks, it's an estimated 6,000 people became familiar with and learned the story by viewing the exhibit in the Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. Because the story was gaining such national interest, in 2018, then the board of directors of the nonprofit organization, the Sultana Historic Preservation and Corporate Society, Inc., decided that the small temporary museum was no longer adequate to tell the story, nor could it accommodate the collection of artifacts and documents that we were retrieving, that we were acquiring. and decided to expand to a new site, to a larger museum. The board of directors decided to at first build a new museum, but later received quite an offer from the local Marion public school system, in that the public school system was in the process of building new facilities for itself. And the Marion public school system then offered to us, basically at no charge, a 17,000 square foot building, which was originally the original gymnasium for the school district, to the society as a location for the new museum. With the acquisition of this beautiful old WPA building, we contracted with an architectural firm from Memphis, Tennessee, a company called Hazlip Studios, who are very well known for designing and constructing community museums nationwide. And they have begun the work of designing a facility and remodeling the building that we have acquired, and adding on an additional 4,000 to 5,000 square feet, so that we will, within the next couple of years, we hope to open in 2024, a new 22,000 square foot museum that will tell the complete story of the Sultana, have one location for all of our artifacts, as well as an archive of several thousand documents and Civil War letters and the records of the soldiers on board the Sultana. And that museum, we hope, will become of great national attention. And so the organization that you asked about, which the acronym for Sultana Historic Preservation Society, Inc., is SHPS, or SHIPS. And so SHIPS will administer and own the 22,000 square foot museum. It now administers the small museum in the interim. In addition to that, we have created a very nice new website to replace an old, inadequate website. The website can be reached by going to www.sultanadisastermuseum.com. Just all one word, sultanadisastermuseum.com. And it has numerous pages. It's somewhat interactive. You can use that website to join the museum, to learn individual stories about the soldiers and people and passengers and crew members who were on board, anecdotal stories, legends, myths that we can share with the general public. You can see some conceptual designs that have been of the new museum that have been posted on there, and basically learn the story of the Sultana until such time as you can actually make a visit to the museum. The organization is very active. Our board of directors meets regularly and makes both administrative and managerial decisions that are guiding the museum and the creative activities that will eventually open up this new museum in a couple more years.
And so what is the organization's mission?
The mission of the organization is twofold. First, of course, and foremost, is to nationally tell the story of the Sultana, which was not only acknowledged as the greatest maritime disaster in all of United States history, the magnitude of which for American history is even greater than the Titanic, but that the story was hidden from the American public and from the general knowledge of the American public, and it was left out of our history books and texts and basically left out of our history for more than 130 years. So the first mission is to tell the story of the last great event, the last great tragedy of the Civil War, and to give these 2,200 people and these 2,000 soldiers their rightful place in history so that they can be remembered. In addition to that, the second part of our mission statement is to make known the important role that the Mississippi River and these people played in the American Civil War, and to understand the region along the central Mississippi River Valley because of the vast importance, the great role that it played in the conclusion of the Civil War when you consider the taking of the Mississippi River, the corridor, and controlling the Western theater of war by Grant and his armies, and then those final battles that took place as a part of the Anaconda plan, which was the Northern plan to win the Civil War. And in addition to those two mission points, you might say, it's to make our region known. Most people have heard of the Delta, but this museum and this story is a reason for people to come to the Delta and learn the history and learn the people and come to know this central part of the United States that is so very important to the development of our whole nation, because the great Mississippi River is the heart of our country, and it flows right straight through this central part of the nation. And we are right here, and right here rests the remains of the Sultana. The remains of the Sultana have been located underneath a bean field in Marion, Arkansas, across the river from Memphis, Tennessee. And it is an area of great history, food, music, and amazing culture that we're hoping to introduce to the rest of the nation and the world. And along with other museums that have been created in the area, we are helping to create a great museum trail from the top of Arkansas to the bottom of Arkansas, with this museum, the Sultana Disaster Museum, being the central part of that museum trail.
What lessons were learned after the tragedy?
Because the tragedy was unknown to most of the nation, very few people even knew the tragedy occurred except those who were involved and the people locally in Memphis and Marion. And because there was a lack of communications in 1865 nationwide, most people did not know of the tragedy. And so individual lessons may not have been learned at that time. However, one great lesson was learned. When you examine the Sultana tragedy and you know the story, you realize that it was the culmination of the American Civil War. It was the last great event, or the ending point of the Civil War. The people involved were Union soldiers who had fought to retain the United States, to save the Union, and to eliminate slavery. These men put their lives on the line, and they fought in battles, they were captured, they suffered, and then they were betrayed on their way home by their own officers, ranking officers in Vicksburg, causing many of their deaths. Their sacrifice should not be remembered. And the lesson learned from their sacrifice is that our country was saved at that point and can always be saved despite our differences. When men and women come together with understanding and have a real care and concern for each other. And may I give you an example of that? When the Sultana exploded and burned, and 2,200 people were either killed or thrown into the frigid Mississippi River in the middle of the night, people from both sides of the river, Northerners, Southerners, Union soldiers in boats, and Confederate soldiers camped along the riverside, all went into the river and made efforts to save as many people as possible. This was within 2 weeks of the Civil War ending, and no one gave any concern to what side they had been on or what their sympathies were during the Civil War. This was a tragedy. People were in trouble. People needed to be saved. And everyone, North and South, Union and Confederate, came to the rescue of these people. And the city of Memphis, the people of Marion, Arkansas, both took care of those who perished as well as those who survived. And so I think the great lesson of the Sultana in the end is a lesson of reconciliation, that we can always reconcile our differences and become the great nation that our founders had intended once again.
Well, I thank you for taking the time to do this interview with me. I will try to get this done around the end of March, and I will send you my work once it's done.
Well, I'm very proud of the work you're doing, and I want to thank you for all of the work and letters and information that you've given us in the past. They will all be included in our archive for people to see or to have access to. And I thank you for your great work very, very much.
Yeah. So thank you, Louis.
If I can ever be of any more help, don't hesitate to give me a call, okay?
Okay.